My name is John Mitchell. I'm Vice Dean for Education in the UCL Faculty of Engineering and co-director of the Centre for Engineering Education that is hosting this event tonight. I was just going to open by saying a little bit about that centre. Essentially, it's an organisation that was jointly between the engineering faculty at UCL and what was then the Institute of Education, now the UCL Institute of Education, and a simulation is taking place rapidly there. But very much an idea of bringing together practitioners in engineering education and those working on educational theory and practice to support people developing different ways of educating engineers and attracting people to engineering, whether that be from looking at the early stages through to university education or lifelong learning, but really intending to be a platform for those that are interested in all manner of things within that scope to come together, to debate, to discuss, hopefully to bring some of the leverage that we have within those two faculties at UCL to bear on some of the issues we see across that whole piece. As part of some of the things we do, we organise this conversation series. And the idea here is we get two distinguished guests with points of view to make and get an audience involved in discussing what we think are the issues around particular topics. And the topic we looked at tonight was really about what it takes to be an engineer. And I've already had a certain amount of criticism for the first line I wrote on the invitation that went out about engineers solving equations. It was determined to try and actually spark a little bit of debate before. I had a former Vice Chancellor calling me and go, "How dare you put that into it?" so it's obviously done the job already, but we'll follow it up. The format is relatively straightforward. Each of our guests have 10 minutes to sort of set a scene, put a point of view across, and then we want this to be a conversation. We would like input from the floor and a to and fro of ideas and discussion. We capture this on video. Please let us know if you have any problems with your image being used, and we'll try and find ways around it. And these get posted to the website of the centre. So, for good reason that you might see, I will let our guests introduce themselves. But we have Professor Nick Tyrer and Sara John with us tonight to talk about what they see as the essence of an engineer. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm not an engineer, so I'm very pleased and not a little surprised to be asked to speak tonight, and thank you for asking me. I'm actually a lawyer. I read law at university and moved into the city and spent most of my career in the music business, moving from representing pop stars to advising companies and government as well on policy connected with music industry, with creative industries, and that area. So culturally important these industries are, and very valuable to the UK, but not as valuable or as huge as engineering. And I think that the industries that I represent and work with have similar problems and have had similar problems to engineering in how they portray themselves, perhaps for different reasons. If you look at the Royal Academy for Engineering, they say that their purpose is to promote excellence in the science, art, and practice of engineering. And yes, there is art in engineering. It's easy to forget sometimes when you read a lot of reports, which I've been reading, which just focus very, very, very narrowly on STEM. And I think the narrow STEM focus communicates a very stunted vision of what it is to be an engineer, actually. That's a bit blunt, but I think there is a bit of a branding problem here, to use the language of creative industry. And actually, creative industries had the same problem a few years ago, many years ago, when the internet first changed the nature of music, film industries. They became more converged, and our products became much, much easier to distribute. And there were a huge number of technology companies with pipes and wires down which they wanted to put our music and films. And they wanted to call it content, as if it didn't much matter what was pumped down the lines. It was just something to put down the lines. And we became content industries. So we go to Brussels and say, oh, you know, we're very important, but somehow or other we were just content. It didn't matter. And it may be, I think language is incredibly important. It may be a coincidence, but I think that creative industries started to revive the moment we called ourselves creative industries, because it communicates so much better what it is that we do. I think engineering deserves more than being the filler in the sandwich. It's much more than the E in STEM. And creative industries instinctively dislike STEM as a concept anyway, because we feel it's overvalued in the education system and has led to a very narrow focus, which ignores arts, humanities, and an awful lot of skills that engineers, as everybody does, need. And this is a problem for creative industries, but it's also a problem for engineering. Preparing for today, I Googled what are the top 10 engineering employers. And along with the people I expected to find, like NASA and Rolls-Royce, I found Walt Disney, and I found, which is a creative company, and I found Google at number 1, actually. And their idea of recruitment, it is very Google. And so they have a strapline, do cool things that matter. And if you go to their page for work experience or internships, there's a little box and you can click on it, and the very first thing that comes up is engineering and technology, so that's what they're looking for more than anything else. But there's liberal arts on there, there's everything on there, nothing's excluded. And then you click through, and there's a page which says, bring questions, build answers. It's about what you're doing and inspiring people to want to be something before you talk about what qualifications they need, which I think is really the right way around here. And they have a little section with lots of Google employees saying how wonderful it is to work at Google in a very googly way. And they say, what's the best thing about working at Google? And somebody says, oh, it's having a big impact on improving things in the world. Well, you know, I can see why engineers would like that, and I can see why engineers would want to work at a company that says that's their purpose. And if you contrast that with the Daily Telegraph's engineering jobs listing, it says, engineering is a technical field which typically requires advanced specialization. In addition to holding field-relevant degrees, engineers have strong backgrounds in mathematics. Now, I suppose that's true, but is it inspiring? Maybe not so much. And I think by underplaying creativity as a profession, engineering is selling itself short. If you look at the 2014 Twitter poll in The Engineer, that listed people's top engineering heroes. And they're all people like Brunel, Leonardo da Vinci, various people, Tim Berners-Lee, people who did not operate in silos. And people, when they think of, a member of a public thinks of what an engineer is, I think they think of how you do something and maybe why you do it, rather than what you actually do. And it's engineering as a state of mind. And I think that's a much better way of selling the profession. And engineering sites aimed at women have adopted this approach. I don't know why they feel that women are particularly receptive to this, but why should I become an engineer, asks engineeringgirl.com, all in pastel colours, which rather irritated me. Sorry, but I was young in the 1970s, so I didn't like it. But apart from the engineering Barbie aspect of it, what they actually said was very good. They said, why should you become an engineer? You'll have the power to make a difference. True. And in fact, my son's headmaster said that was probably the most motivating thing to get anybody to go and do anything. these days, because young people are very idealistic. You'll be working with other talented people. Everybody wants to do that. You don't want to go to somewhere where, you're not necessarily, you won't fit in, and you'll have lots of options. True also, nobody wants to go somewhere they're not sure whether they'll like it or not. They want a profession that's going to give them, prepare them for lots of different careers. And you'll have money and job security. I'm sorry, but it's quite important. And that's also true of engineering. And you'll get to do cool stuff. Be the first to develop or try out a new technology, like a flying car or an undersea house. I mean, yes, it's a bit silly on one level, but I think it is opening up the profession to a wider pool of creative and motivated people, and I think these things are important. I first met Nick and many other wonderful representatives of the engineering profession when we worked together on something called an Agenda for Creative Education, and Nick spoke at the launch, which was at the Institution of Civil Engineers. And the idea of this report was to look at creativity in creative industries and in engineering, and try to distill some important points from that. And what we agreed on was that science and arts are not an either-or, and yet only 8.4% of English students combine arts and STEM subjects at A level, which is a tiny proportion. And obviously this is a big issue for engineering, because if you don't meet your engineering skills demand, that's going to cost huge numbers, 27 billion a year according to Engineering UK. And this debate about polarization and narrowing down of education is happening across the board. It's not just happening in engineering or creative industries, it's happening in economics. So the Institute of New Economic Thinking has been set up a few years ago, and Wendy Carlin from UCL is looking at this, leading a project to reform the economics curriculum, which students are very unhappy with because they're saying it's not fitting them for the real world. And in a recent article I read in the Daily Telegraph, Martin Sorrell, the sort of advertising guru, argues that business schools are placing an over-reliance on analytical models and spreadsheets at the expense of innovation and creativity, because the former are easier to measure. And he's saying, I don't go into a museum of fine arts and say, I saw 800 square feet of paintings today. It's just not what you do. I don't know. Looking at tech, I think, is quite important, just quickly. Tech is the T in STEM, but if you look at the way they have branded themselves, I think they've done it quite cleverly, and they're more than that now. A few years ago, you might have said, when they were calling themselves technology, you might have thought, oh, a bit nerdy, a bit male, a bit sort of niche. But they've taken very specific steps to appeal to a very wide range of people. London's tech sector is now one of the world's most diverse. In London, women are 3 times more likely to get involved in a startup than they are in Silicon Valley, which I found quite interesting. And they have programs for the over 50s, going back to work. They have programs for mothers, with small children who, driving up the wall and want to do something more interesting. And no one's excluded. So it's sort of very important to capture that enthusiasm. I think in the engineering sector, possibly the organisation that does that best is the Institution for Mechanical Engineers, actually. They've put a lot of reports together, which, and I don't know if that's true in the real world, but when you look at what reports are out there, I loved their 5 Tribes report, which looked at school students and looked at sort of 5 different groups of school students who wouldn't normally, who aren't applying for engineers, but are potential engineers because they're very strong in STEM subjects. There's one group in particular called social artists, who are 55% female. And apparently they would be much more likely to consider engineering if the engineering community itself was better able to promote its creative side. They were much more interested in the art and design as a way in. And if you have all this sort of vast growth and you have job vacancies you need to fill, then these are untapped resources that you need to think about. And IMechE is thinking about it. And their latest report, the sort of big ideas report I liked as well, it sort of talks about broadening routes into engineering degree courses, promoting more flexible entry requirements, which I know Nick is quite big on, maintaining a broad curriculum up to the age of 18, and using design and technology as a platform for integrating STEM with creative design. I think the key things really are that if you think about what makes an engineer, it's creativity, it's breadth, some form of art. There's an artistic side. It's not just a science. And I think you should promote engineering as socially beneficial, because it is. And if I had to say what was the best description of what makes an engineer, I think the Science Museum has come up with it in their Engineering the Future exhibition, which is aimed at 11 to 15-year-olds, which is great because it's before they make decisions which are going to change their life. And they say, could you shape the world we live in? Find out if you've got the problem-solving, big-thinking, team-working skills to be a globe-trotting engineer of tomorrow. And I find that quite inspirational for a teenager. And I think I think it's a better way of encouraging people to do engineering than focusing on the lack of physics teaching or the lack of, girls doing maths A-level. Because if you want to be an engineer badly enough, you will make sure that you develop the skills that you need. Nobody chooses to become a doctor necessarily because they're good at physics. They want to be a doctor very badly, and they make themselves good at physics to do it. So I think that's where I'd like to finish.
Okay.
So.
Thank you very much, Sara. That's really good. So, my name is Nick Tyler. So until a couple of years ago, I was the head of civil engineering here at UCL, and I did my 10.5-year stint and survived. Whether the department did is, of course, another question. But what you were saying sort of reminds me of a few things. Let's sort of start with a few just odd things. UCL actually had the very, very first chair in engineering in England. And that was called the Chair of Engineering and the Application of Mechanical Philosophy to the Arts. They knew how to call things in those days. And that was in 1826. And they appointed a guy called John Millington. And John Millington, he was here for 1 year, and then he had a row with the centre of UCL about the money. Nothing changes. And he left to go and run a silver mine in Mexico. And a couple of years after that, he went to the William and Mary College in the United States, where he became their first professor of civil engineering. He wrote the first civil engineering book in English. All were in French before that. And then he decided that actually the really exciting world was medicine. So he decided to go and train as a doctor, and he eventually took a doctorate of medicine and finally a PhD in medicine, ended up as a professor of medicine in Memphis. And it's a sort of interesting story to me, because this was a person who was exploring the world. He came here as a civil engineer. That's what he did before he came here. He was sort of suggested to come here by the Institution of Civil Engineers, which was a very young institution at that time. But that sense of actually the world is not a discipline, the world is stuff. And what I want to be able to do is understand. I'm curious about this stuff. I want to understand it. How do I fix it? And maybe there's lots of different ways of fixing things and lots of different approaches. And actually, how do I actually do that? And to me, that's the sort of essence of engineering, is that you don't arrive at a problem by having a solution. You start off by trying to understand if there is a problem at all, and if so, what there is. And then, what do I have to do in order to try and crack this thing and come to a solution. And if that means I have to go and learn medicine, well, I'll have to go and learn medicine. And it's that sort of thing. So we have other curious heads of department in civil, and we seem to attract them. Another one got very interested in transatlantic cables and worked out the attenuation of a transatlantic cable and ended up writing plays with Robert Louis Stevenson in Edinburgh. These sorts of people are creative people, and I don't think they really saw themselves as a thing called an engineer. And I think that's sort of something we've sort of hoiked onto people maybe over the last, I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, or whatever it is. It's a sort of 20th century problem to me, this. And I think it's really interesting that they don't really see themselves in that, or didn't see themselves in that way. And that caused me to wonder what the word meant. So I was reminded that when I started my first day as the head of department in civil engineering, I bought myself a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary because it was the last paper version of the Oxford English Dictionary, and it was going cheap. So I bought this thing, and there's 23 volumes of Oxford English Dictionary, and I was putting this into a bookshelf in my office, and one of the other professors walked past the door and he said, "You've got bookshelves." I said, "Yes, I've got bookshelves." And he said, "And you've got books." And that's a dictionary. And he was really, really astonished that this head of department had a dictionary. So I thought, well, having got this dictionary, I should look up the word engineer. And before you get to engineer in the Oxford English Dictionary, you get to engine. And I guess most people these days would think of an engine as some sort of contraption or mechanical device or some method for doing something with energy and power and things like that. But the go back into the Middle English, and the word engine meant mother wit, genius. And the first person I've found so far who had the title of something near to engineer was called an ingeniator. It was a monk in the 12th century, a chap called Aylnoth, if I pronounced it correctly, and he did all sorts of things, and he was known as a sort of what we would call a sort of a handyman, I guess, and he built some of the Tower of London, so he's pretty handy, because we still have it. And these sort of people are about, how do I actually understand what needs to be done? How do I then set about doing it? How do I create the pathway to that sort of solution? And that, I think, is sort of how I see engineering. So when I took over the department, here I had a department full of engineering professors, very worthy, and they were doing sort of interesting things, and they were teaching civil engineering to interesting students and all the rest of it. But I could see that this was actually a dead road, because what was actually going on was what they were teaching, and to a certain extent what they were researching, was how do I become a civil engineer? And I thought that's the wrong question. So I went to schools. I spent a few months going around different schools. I talked to people from about the age of 11 upwards. So your 11-year-old is about right, I think. 11 upwards. And if I talk to 11, 12, 13-year-olds and I say, well, what would you like to do in the world? And they'll say, I want to fix it. I want to bring water to Africa. I want to make the environment better. I want all these sort of things. If I ask somebody at the age of 18 what they want to do with the world, they'll say, I want to pass my A-levels. And all of that vision and that idealism, we've got an education system that has crushed that out of people between the age of 11 or 12 and the age of 17 or 18. Of course, by the time they come to a university, we have done a pretty good job at crushing the rest of it out. So the first thing we do is we say to them, if you want to come and join my wonderful university, you have to do maths, physics and chemistry. Mm-hmm. They don't actually say why you have to do maths, physics and chemistry, but they sort of say that's what you have to do, and you have to be very good at it and so on. And if you do that, then we'll let you in. And then you end up with this sort of cohort of people who are all a bit cloned. And wonderful and great and all the rest of it, but that's sort of where they are. And I could see this was actually a pathway that doesn't work. So going back to these school children, I thought, So if you want to come to university, you have to do 3 A-levels because that's what the university asks for. So how do you choose the 3 A-levels that you're going to do? Because you're going to make that choice when if you're lucky, you might make that choice when you're 16. But many schools, I found particularly in less well-off areas, you're making that decision when you're maybe 13 or 14 because the availability of options is actually constrained by the sort of school that you have. So these decisions are actually being, if not made, they're being sort of chopped down at an age when you should be opening things up. And so I asked them, how did you choose your 3 A-levels? And they sort of looked very thoughtful, and they said, well, my boyfriend was doing French. Chemistry clashed with football. I really liked the history teacher. And the most common answer, by a huge margin, the most common answer I had was, I hate the maths teacher. And I sort of realised that it's quite interesting that you've got people of the age of maybe 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 or whatever it is, making this sort of decision in their daily life, which is actually going to affect what they're going to do for the rest of their life on the basis of how they think, how they see the world. And how they see the world with their 15, 16 years of experience is around those sorts of things. What's important to them then? And why not? And so I realised that maybe if we, also talking to them, I could see that there were some really, really smart people who were choosing different sorts of subjects. If you've got 15 A stars at GCSE, how do you choose the 3 A-levels that you're going to pursue? You're going to choose the ones you want, the ones you like, the ones that don't cause you trouble. It doesn't mean that they're easy, it just means that they're interesting, they're inspiring, or whatever the rationale is. Why don't we have those people in engineering? So I removed all the requirement for A-levels. We have to have A-level grades. I discovered there's no rule in the university that said I could say anything about the subjects. It just said grades. Ha. So I just removed very quietly the requirement for A-level subjects and met a pile of complaints from the staff. Do you mean you'll accept people with what is it? Somebody said, photography, French and swimming. Somebody said, the world's going to end, all these people are going to come in with no maths, how on earth are we going to teach them? It's going to be terrible. Industry all complained that we're going to have all these people with no maths. The failure rate of maths students at that time, at the end of the first year, was around about 20%. Some years it would be more. They would fail maths at the end of their first year at university. So, and yet they were graduating eventually at some point. So something happened. And so, but I knew from the conversations that I've been having with the schools that actually there was a very small number of people who would turn up without maths, physics and chemistry. And I had a sort of pretty sure guess that actually that number would be small enough that we could deal with it. It would not be a big problem. And eventually we managed to convince the staff by just sort of, so oops, well, I've already done it. You can be naive as a head of department sometimes. And the thing that really converted all the staff was when the students arrived, because they couldn't believe the quality of the student. And we had, out of a cohort at that time, it was about 70, I think, we had a cohort of 70 people, and there were 4 people without maths or physics. And so we helped those 4 people. We gave them a tutor, we give them actually, very importantly, we give them a friendly tutor. Not somebody who's going to tell them how difficult maths is, but somebody who will help them through it, and so on. And we did some sort of rationalisation of the maths curriculum to try and make it a bit more relevant, because they were learning all sorts of maths that they were never, ever in a million years ever going to use. And we were much more interested because actually we're a university. I'm not here to train people to be an engineer. I'm here to educate people, if you like, with an engineering way of thinking. I think it's a philosophy. And that mother wit thing, how can we organise mother wit to be a bit more effective than it would be if we just let it run? That's the sort of thing. And so what I want is bright people who can talk, who can create, who can have the vision of bringing water to Africa, and then actually have a think about how you might do it. and try and pull that together and try and excite each other to be able to do that, so that actually the whole teaching environment is not teaching. I tried to ban the word teaching from the university. That really didn't work, because I wanted the word learning. Because actually I don't think we're in an environment where one side teaches and the other side learns. I think we're in an environment where everybody learns, and the best learning environment is where what you're actually doing is sharing and learning your experiences. I have experiences of many years, maybe, some of them might be useful. The students arriving are coming with experiences of maybe 17 or 18 years, but it's experiences, and many of those experiences are experiences that I do not have. And so generating the relationship between those in a way that every side learns creates an atmosphere in which you start to understand how to tackle a problem. And that tackling the problem then enables us to be able to move. So for me, what makes an engineer, I would say, first off, is curiosity. Look at Leonardo da Vinci. For him, curiosity was the big thing. It was his biggest thing. Lots of quotes about that. Curiosity, willing to want to learn, the ability to look at a situation and work out, without prejudice, what are the things I have to do in order to fix this problem. And it might be singing a song, or it might be turning a nut in a cog. But actually, it's about how I create a way of thinking about that problem that makes the problem able to be resolved. And I think that is what I see as making an engineer.
Thank you, Nick. So, often we start by trying to have opposing views,
I know,
but
sorry.
it's always very difficult in this situation. But two slightly different strands and different ways of coming to things. Open it up to the floor. Would anyone like to comment, respond?
You pointed on a few things that I've had. I've had experience of engineering education in 4 different countries. And one of the ones I'm going to pick up, it's going to be too long if I pick one more, is the fact that I find the UK system far too narrow. And when you lose the breadth, you lose that idea of being creative and inventive. There are things we're trying to fix here, but I agree with you, it starts far too early. If you have to choose a narrow set of subjects by the age of 16, and even a bit earlier with your GCSE, you might concentrate on just a few, then you lose that kind of ideas that to understand the world, you need to understand the fast and rough things. If I compare this with other systems, so the Germans have quite a narrow system as well in a sense. And they end up with engineer graduates that are as well quite good at what they do, but they lack that kind of pride. With the Italian and the French that are broader, at least until the age of 18, then you see a very different set of perceptions and the way people work on this. And some of those countries have much less issues in trying to recruit people into engineering because they are seen as carriers that have much more, that attract basically bright people from almost every background. And I think that's one of the key issues in the UK. I agree with you, it's the breadth. And we get rid of it far too early.
Yeah. No,
and in university, changing this in university is quite hard.
Yeah, you have to be revolutionary.
You have to brush out quite a few years of...
Yeah. I did suggest to the provost we removed all the faculties. Because actually, I devised a course, a master's course for arts and sciences. We have a bachelor's program in arts and sciences, and this is going to be a really super duper course. It's brilliant. But where it fell over was we could get all the intellectual approvals after some sort of work on it, but the financial system of the university runs vertically, if you like, down through faculties and things. And as soon as you do that, the money becomes disciplinary, and so you can't do anything across. And it's really, really hard to do stuff across. So the only real way you can lose that, if you really want to understand the problem, you have to cut the money in a different, because it eventually does come down to money. And therefore, if you were to do that, I would just take people in simply to study. You know, I mean, one could, and I don't really mind what the subject is, rather like they're choosing A-levels, something that interests them, that's fine.
Well, you can get a successful liberal degree here.
Yeah.
Some of the students we met, John and I met some of them last
Yeah,
years ago.
They're amazing
They
students.
They
Yeah.
are amazing.
Yeah.
They don't have many, but they are amazing. They come from every
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting actually because if you look at what industry is doing, I mean, industry is all about convergence and bringing in more people with different points of view. And the Creative Industries Council, they chose as their very first award to give to in an award show something to do with convergence, and they gave an award to Andy Serkis, who was Gollum in Lord of the Rings. He's directing Jungle Book, which is employing 1,000 people, many of them engineers probably. And he's also got something called the Imaginarium Studio, which is about visual effects and different things. And I mean, this is really what the ultimate that people are aiming at. You know, people who are doing a range of different things from different angles. And sometimes you can do it in one person, like Andy Serkis, and most often you do it by assembling teams of people with different skills and so on. But you're right, it's specialisation is over-specialisation in the English system particularly is appalling. It's getting worse.
Thank you. So much to say, so many different things to pick up on. I guess fundamentally I agree with both of what you're saying, but I'm going to kind of throw a hand grenade in and play devil's advocate because that's what you
Do it, yeah.
I think we have to kind of recognise that the reason why we have STEM in schools is because there was a crisis in science and engineering departments in the kind of early 2000s, and Gareth Roberts did his review, which brought about kind of SET, it's the Set for Success report, and then that turned into STEM. And so we had to put a focus on STEM in schools because students weren't doing those subjects. And we're still not out of the woods with those subjects. There are only 30,000 students taking physics A-level out of a cohort of 600,000 every year. So this is, it falls off a cliff edge in one step. So there are still real issues. Now, there aren't those kinds of issues still with some of the creative subjects. Again, this is full of caveats because I do agree with what you're saying. We then have to say, okay, so I took your point, Nick, about students get A stars in all these subjects. So what do they make their decisions on? Well, it's actually about their interest, their inspiration, what they're enthused by. And I completely agree that point about the maths teacher. Actually, it's usually the physics teacher is really boring and physics is really dull. And it's because often the physics teacher is a biologist who was teaching physics. They got no understanding of physics really beyond what they did when they were doing their GCSEs. They just happened to do biology for their degree, became a science teacher as in kind of general science, and then they have to teach all three sciences. So they're as kind of unenthused by the subject as the kids. But nevertheless, we going back to your point about this kind of hiking on the name engineering the last 50 to 100 years, and the kind of historical root of engineering, which is really fascinating. I hadn't picked up that. I was thinking more it was kind of come from the etymological root was French, ingenious, ingenuity, and so on. But we don't have time to allow students or allow engineers in industry to kind of discover, the maths required to build the bridge or to build the dome. We need them to learn that in their education. So we're on an accelerated pathway. We know that, the bridge might fail under some kind of non-linear buckling mode. So we have to teach that in the university. So we haven't got the time to explore. And we have a truncated HE system as well, compared to our lots of other countries, European countries, and so on. So, and we have to meet output standards set by the institution so that we can have accreditation. I'm looking at the Chief Executive of the Institute of Engineering and Technology right now. So you haven't got the time to take in lots and lots of students who don't have the right subjects, because you need to get lots and lots of maths and science into them in a short amount of time so that they can graduate with the relevant qualifications, so that the chap behind me, who's from Atkins, knows that his engineers are going to be, able to do the job.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and no one's saying that you shouldn't study physics. It's just that we're saying it's just too narrow if that's all you do. And unfortunately, when you give the idea that STEM is important to a politician, they could walk away with the idea that it's the only thing that matters, and then everything else suffers, and your whole education becomes too narrow. So that's really to put it in context. And it's a question of definition also. I mean, if part of your crisis is a lack of physics teachers, but part of it is a lack of take-up of the subject. And my point was, which maybe I didn't make well enough, but it was just that if people are enthused by what they can do with physics as a career, and enthused about the idea of being an engineer, of course they need physics, of course they need maths. I'm not sort of so woolly-headed as to believe that they don't. But the way to get them to take up physics isn't to jump up and down saying how important physics is, it's to actually enthuse them about what they can do with it. That was my point. And there's not enough in the engineering literature to do that, in my view. It's just STEM, 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 STEM.
Gentleman in front.
We're not going to unnarrow the British school curriculum. I mean,
Not this evening, no.
Not
well,
all in one go.
probably ever, unfortunately. But the other way of looking at it is, if we just accept that lots of potential engineers are not studying engineering, or people that could be good engineers are just studying because of accident design, not liking the right teacher, not going to the right school or whatever, but they can still be a good engineer. What our system also doesn't allow is a sort of second chance. So you get to the degree that you're doing in whatever, and it's often not until you finish your degree that you understand what you want to do. So there's probably a way of having narrowed people down, unnarrowing them and looking at postgraduate conversion of people with non-engineering degrees. So, you do foundation years, lots of universities do that for those that haven't quite taken the brave step of not wanting maths at all. But you can do it after a degree as well.
Yeah.
There's I'm not sure where the institutions stand on this, but there are no, from an employer perspective, there's not obvious non-cognate routes for converting, someone with an economics degree into being a civil engineer. And they're probably as good at maths.
We do have a programme that does that.
But they're not obvious out there. So, from an employer perspective, the other employers are really, if someone applied to us with an economics degree to become an engineer, we could probably make something up.
Yeah.
But we couldn't go out and actively advertise it and search for those sort of people. And it'd be lovely to be able to do so.
Yeah, that's interesting, because actually the Royal Academy have just done a mapping of the STEM landscape in education, and it's very interesting. But actually one of the most interesting things is I think there's about 14,000 jobs filled in engineering capacity by engineering and technology degrees, but about 4,000 are filled by people who have degrees in creative art and arts. So there must be ways in different companies, which it's choosing your company. Maybe it's companies like Google or companies like that who are sort of seeing different ways of using those skills and sort of channeling them in an engineering direction.
Well, the reality, I mean, IET, ICE, they all have quite rightly certain educational needs. So, but there's there has to be ways of, if we can't get enough people choosing it in the first place, let's convert some people who might have thought it was too late.
Exactly.
Come to Nigel.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Reece. So, Carl Nigel, I'm Chief Executive of the IET. Firstly, thank you very, very interesting discussion so far, and I completely agree with what you both said. If I look at my start in life, sort of civil engineering, it was all about doing something, creating something, and then sometimes you have to do maths and physics. But you get through that in order to achieve your own goals. So I'm completely subscribing to that. What I want to come back to is the fact that this is all good stuff, but we have a real problem in this country. We have a real skills crisis. So the question really is all about how we're going to change the dynamics of the number of people going into engineering. Yes, there may be a branding issue. Is engineer the wrong word? We need to talk about technology. We only have 7% of the workforce that are females. Obviously, many young women here in the audience tonight. But in your profession, the legal profession, if you go back in time, it was a very male-dominated
It was.
profession.
It was when I
Now
started,
it's
yeah.
changed enormously. Medicine has changed enormously, that there are more women studying in medical school than there are boys. So you can, it's not like we are different. There are other industries and professions that have also faced this, but they've solved it. And what I'm interested in, though, is how do we change behaviour and the influences of parents and teachers? Because we can sit here and have this really comfortable discussion, but it's not solving the problem. How do we actually go out and do something that's going to make a big difference? I would love to know your views on how do we make a big difference, because if we don't, this country's going to suffer.
I think I would sort of put the sort of three interventions we had together, actually, because I think one of the things that I'm not so sure about the legal profession, but certainly the medical profession has done a lot of work, certainly in some parts of it, including here, on sort of thinking about the concept that a student walks through the door of the university at the age of whatever it is, day one, and comes out 7 years later with a certificate, basically, that says that they can do stuff. And that in that 7 years, they will have done an undergraduate degree, they will have done a master's degree of some sort, they will have done a lot of sort of on the workbench sort of practical experience in industry. And if I look at an engineering program, what I will see, if you took that same slice, from the student going into the university to getting their chartership, you're talking similar sort of period of time, sort of 7-ish years. In that time, they will have done an undergraduate degree and a master's degree and some time in industry. But the difference is, in the medical case, it's much, much more smoothly integrated between the if you like, the industry, the practice side, and the academic side, partly because we have a thing called the National Health Service, so you have one employer, so it makes it a lot easier, but partly because there is a much, much closer integration between the people working in the hospitals and the medical profession, and the teaching of it are actually much, much more aligned. And in the engineering case, what happens is that you do your 3 or 4 years in university, you then jump off a precipice, go into a company who then has to pick up something which isn't quite what they want, and they have to mould it into becoming an engineer. And eventually, after your 7 years, you sort of get there. But it's a very traumatic experience. And I think that we could do a lot more by having a much, much stronger interrelationship between the industry and the universities, and possibly the schools as well, in order to get that transition much, much smoother, and then it feels...
Possibly. I think there's also,
Sorry, I mean, my point was, you've got them in the university to study medicine. How do we get them in the university to study engineering in the first place?
Well,
This is how you change them at school,
Yeah.
how do the parents influence young people about taking a career in engineering? How do the teachers get involved? You've got to get them to the door in the first place.
When I talked to my son's headmaster, he said the main motivation would be to say how you can actually use the skills of an engineer to make a difference. And I think there is room for a rebranding exercise. And it might sound frivolous, but there are so many reports on the engineering sector, and it's all focusing on the lack of this or the problem about that, and it's not empowering. But the profession is, and I think law had that image too. I mean, I didn't actually want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't see how I could sort of support myself doing that. So I started on law, and I hated it as an academic subject. It was like learning the rules of Monopoly and never being allowed to play. But once I could play, I loved it. And so there's certain sort of pain you have to go through with some of these professions to actually get to the interesting bit. And I don't think it's sort of bad to tell people that necessarily. Okay, you have to study physics if you want this really exciting job of being an engineer. Sort of, I think that's fair enough to say that. But I think the important thing is to actually have somewhere out there, somebody saying something exciting about how brilliant it is to be an engineer. I mean, I sort of once heard someone called Claire Gott talk. She's a civil engineer, and she came to engineering because she did some volunteering in Cameroon. And she ended up setting up Cameroon Catalyst, which is a charity, helping people, particularly with fresh water in Africa, in Cameroon. She works for a construction company, and she's been doing things with London Bridge Station and elsewhere. And she's a very good communicator, and people like that are the people you should be employing to actually get out there and enthuse people about it, because she enthused me, and I was thinking, I'm 50, it's too late for me. But, it's if I was young now, it's exactly what I would be thinking of doing. Even though I was rubbish at physics, I would make myself good at physics to do it. I think
that's absolutely right. And one of the problems we have is that the exciting thing about engineering is building a bridge or building a transit or whatever it is. And actually, that's not what gets them going. What gets them going is fixing the water in Cameroon. Mm. And I think we have to raise the game. Medicine, it doesn't get sold by simply being medicine. It gets sold by helping people live, and helping. It's the higher level piece that they can sell. And to a certain extent, I think law is in a similar sort of position. And I think that's the problem with engineering is we sell the nuts and bolts. We don't actually sell the thing above that actually says this is a fantastic, just a very, very exciting, fantastic world to be in. And let's go and do that. And by the way, yes, you're going to have to, our non-maths entrants have to do the same maths and physics as everybody else. They don't get any remission. They get help, but they have to do it because you can't do it without it. And they understand that challenge. It's not, I think, isn't the problem. I think the problem is we sell the wrong thing.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do is try and find a way of joining the threads together for a minute, but with a kind of specific example in a second. Because I like the reason, I kind of accept the argument, and also I understand why some people said we've got to have the maths and the physics, etc. in the schools. But when I roll back several decades when I was actually a deputy head in a school, I was trying to change things. It wasn't, unfortunately, to get people to become engineers, but basically the two strategies to get change occurred in school, and I'm not sure they've changed a great deal over time. Either you displace something in the curriculum and replace it with something else. That actually is the easiest strategy. The harder one is to get the teachers in the things that are in the curriculum to teach them differently. And there's kind of a recurring argument that I'm not trying to demonise maths and physics. They'll probably say it about most of the subject, because I think it's a problem that if you want the vision that is being asked for, then to some extent the physics teacher or the maths teacher has to be saying something about and how do we contribute to this bigger vision about whether it be medicine or engineering or whatever, rather than how do we just stick taking them down the track alone with the subject. So I'm posing, I suppose, a question of that there is an issue for schools, okay, but have you seen that done in any kind of way? Has anybody in the audience seen things that are actually making things?
I think when I don't want to go on too long, but when we changed our degree programs, I wouldn't allow the staff to talk about their subject.
Don't make it easy.
Because when they start talking about, so what you'll end up with is that all the people in one bit of the discipline will all talk about everything that you need to do in that bit of the discipline, and everybody in another bit of the discipline will do the same, and you end up with far more than you can ever do. So I said, you can't do that. You've got to talk. What we have to do is we have to enable people. We want people to be able to make a better world. So they've got to understand the world they're in. They've got to understand how to change it. They've got to understand the stuff they do in order to do that, and the tools, if you like, in order to do that. That's how you talk. So I set them up so that they had one from each bit of the department in each of those four groups, and they said this is the most dangerous thing we've ever done, because people will find out what I teach. But actually what happened was they discovered there's a lot of duplication, so we could actually get that organized, and then you got space. So the issue of jiggling things around within the curriculum you can do. So yeah, I think, but you have to change the direction of the dialogue. But it's good fun.
We'll come here and then.
Graham Shamara used to be head of learning at Rolls-Royce, and in my current role I'm chair of a UTC on manufacturing users. So, a couple of observations really. The pre-16 curriculum is grindingly difficult to find space in today. I've got 150 kilometres of manufacturing town. Absolutely keen to get young people out and opportunities to explore projects, be with engineers, be with other people. Grindingly difficult to find the space because of this focus on English, math, progress aid. Helpful education advisors come in expecting a bit to watch predicted grades for next. It was easier to build a jet engine than a gas turbine in this. So it's really, really difficult. However, we've got lots of young people who want to do it and frustrated because they're being kept in those. So I agree with you. I'm working really hard to get teachers to, English teachers to think about how might they lead the workshops. That is hard work as well. So pre-16, this is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. I heard the promise this afternoon going about it again. It just drives the wrong step. However, we used to take in 600 graduates and apprentices a year, 30,000 applicants for that. So somewhere the system generates people who really, really want to do it and find a way through. And lots of large companies and medium-sized and small companies get that. The biggest worry I've got is only 15% of companies in the UK have entry-level programs, and the skills shortages tend to be a bit further on with some experience. So this now age thing seems to be a bit of a block in some people's minds as well. So we generate the interest of people who are capable to do it. That's enough opportunity. So the image thing might be about something about the employers rather than the schools.
Yes, hi. I'm from Girls. I'm going to talk from a personal perspective actually. I'm an economist, but I have a daughter who is studying civil and structural engineering at university in her first year. And came through sort of a GCSE, so 15 GCSE A stars, plus her maths, physics, chemistry at A level. Decided that she wanted to go into engineering. Actually sat in a lecture theatre next door for mechanical engineering on an open day. We looked around the room, there were a lot of males there, very few girls. Decided actually that perhaps mechanical wasn't for her. Decided to go down a sort of civil structural engineering route. Was doing both successfully. She applied.
It may have been Mark that they were listening to.
I had no influence at all. Actually, I've always said to my children, I'm the liberal artist in the family. But actually, she followed the route to university, applied for a bursary for the Institute of Engineers, and I thought as a young woman, half Chinese, that she stood a very good chance of actually getting the bursary because of her sort of credentials. She was actually one of the majority, most of the applicants were girls actually at the time of the interview. She was successful and actually found herself with an employer sponsor, Skanska, who she's about to do 2 months on Crossrail at the end of her first year. I had no trouble persuading my daughter that actually if she wanted a good career with global ambitions and was going to get well paid, that engineering was for her, and she lapped it up because actually that's what motivates her, as well as the fact that actually she's very academically able. But I think the argument really should be about the roots to this particular occupational competency, and I think I want to pick up on Toby's route, that actually we've got alternatives potentially through apprenticeships, much more increasingly leading to professional and occupational competency at very high levels, that you don't have to come into full-time HE for. Yep. And that's the route we need to start promoting and start applauding. Actually, I couldn't persuade my daughter to think about an apprenticeship because she wanted the university experience, and that's absolutely fine with me. I have another daughter who's just doing her GCSEs, and if you saw Twitter last night about the AQA biology paper, you'll know how I'm feeling about that biology paper. But actually, she is really going to go down the arts route. So I feel very blessed that I have, that kind of, that personal experience. But is it that the institutions and the Royal Colleges and the professional bodies are having too much sway in terms of the education curriculum and the entry routes? Why are we so persuaded that actually it has to be a full-time degree plus chartership? Why are we not looking at the alternative routes much, much more? Because I think actually that's where the choice will come from young people going forward. They want a workplace experience, not just a body of knowledge. And therefore you'll probably get that sort of potential expansive sort of entry by others.
In the view of this being a conversation, and we've had the IET and the Royal Academy here, I think I shall.
Well, maybe I could answer that question. We are definitely looking at multi-track entry into the profession and really are promoting apprenticeships, technician routes as a way of getting in for people who want to learn and earn at the same time and perhaps have a more vocational bent at the age that they're starting their profession.
It doesn't have to be either or. We still get the split between between academic and vocational. And I think if you look at law, for example, the apprenticeship standard that's been developed over the last 2 years is a non-graduate route becoming fully recognised by the regulator as being a qualified solicitor. There's no mention of a law degree. There's just the professional body requirements. I think we do need to think very differently about the routes in which young people and actually people who return
without any degree.
But we're still very focused on the degree route.
That's
assuming that bids say yes, we have at the moment
hopefully, Tony,
apprenticeship routes 10
in construction,
5 at higher level and 5 at degree level, that exactly lead to Eng Tech status, or when it happens to have an HNC in it as well, and IEng status, or when it happens to have a degree in it as well. Now we're forced to call them degree apprenticeships because that's what the government says, but the original working title was professional apprenticeship. And what we did with those was we took, and IET isn't included actually in the construction one, but we took the ICE's competence framework. If they don't know what a civil engineer is, who does? One would hope. And then work backwards from that. So absolutely, what we want to be able to say to people is, you can join us, and we've got GCSE entry level for the first one, because if you insist on A-level maths, you're not going to get any girls applying. That's exactly that. You will do this, and in 6-7 years' time, a bit like your medical analogy, you will be an incorporated engineer. It's not a chartered level yet, but interest, and the university interest has been massive. We've got a huge number of universities ready to deliver. But interestingly, it's all the ex-polys, and we've got no Russell Group / Red Brick, whatever, interest whatsoever, because the starting point is the concept of delivering higher education on a part-time basis. And the polys have all got that, because they've been doing it for years.
We don't understand that model.
And the
we need to, but we
the
don't.
Russell Group universities. So you've got 2 steps, right? And maybe UCL will be different, who knows? But
we're trying.
yeah,
I spend a lot of my time working on it.
So I'll reinforce what you're saying, but there are, and I know IET are involved in a degree apprenticeship as well, the power one, so it is changing.
No, I do agree. I mean, I think there's when I was saying of getting that piece work together between the industry and the education side at its various levels, actually I think that's the real key to this. Because university, for whatever reason, and I'm not defending it here, has a problem about part-time students, basically. But if they weren't part-time students, they just happened to be doing some of their degree in one place and some of it in another, then they would probably be able to manage it. It's just because the administrators aren't that bright. So we could probably sort of wangle it. So the oh God, there's a camera here. I think, but that's it's the spirit behind it. So what you're describing, what you're asking for, I think, is absolutely right. The university model is a model, but it's by no means the only or the best one. It's one part of a jigsaw of what is an engineer. Is just one little piece of it, and I think in a way we've got too burdened with trying to pretend that we provide the whole picture of engineering. And TfL is always going on about spanner turners, that they can't find people to sort of do the stuff on the ground. And we, I think in a way getting that sorted out as to how we actually join it together, not so that we're all pieces that don't talk to each other, but as one comprehensive piece would be a great step forward.
I was very interested in those two things, and just the two things we didn't talk about. I'm Phil Davis from Atkins, and I'm going to come back to the exam question in a moment, but I wanted to pick up this issue about apprenticeships and FE, HE and so on, because even when you're building a degree apprenticeship, you're still constrained by the quantum chunks of the education system. Okay, you don't have to put a qualification into it. But if someone's done a geography degree, for example, there's no easy way to badge up or collect the qualification, the learning you've gained that you can apply somewhere else because you've got an engineering degree. You might have some A-levels, but you've got an engineering degree. I believe the American system's better. I believe they're much better at collecting what education you've done as you go through. But we're very tied up by level 3, level 4, level 5 and so on. And that is really polarising the way people are learning. So I'll mention that one. Just coming back to Nick's point though about Hamiltoners, my background is railway signalling engineering, and I can't tell you how many times we've recruited fine graduates from university, and then in the first week we send them out on the track pulling cables, and after a few weeks we put them in the drawing office and they're working on 30 or 40-year-old systems, and just can't understand what they've let themselves in for. Because at university, they've done state-of-the-art stuff, and they're using state-of-the-art technology, and then we put them in the drawing office, and they're modifying databases with 286 PCs, because that was the technology at the time, and technology doesn't always move that fast. So I've also heard from architects who say we don't actually always recruit from the most creative universities for architecture, because that's not necessarily what we do. And I've heard architects say that some young people, a lot of architects put them in the office, the first thing they're doing is designing toilet cubicles or things like that, which is far from exciting. But they think they're going to design the verge, but they're not. They're going to do lesser stuff to begin with. So, what counted?
The universities are too exciting.
I'm sure we can help that, Chris.
I totally agree with Phil's point actually, and the Academy is working with the engineering institutions and a number of industry players to develop a new brand for engineering, and we're slowly working on it, and at some point later this year we'll probably start to socialise a new marketing campaign for engineering. But one of the real issues we've got is that we can't sell a line, and we want to, of course we will present engineering as a human-centred activity. It's about developing humanity and improving lives and so on, and of course some engineers, lots of engineers do really interesting creative things, and it might be building water supplies in Cambodia, but actually a lot of engineers are in a drawing office in a crappy little industrial estate in Luton, and I was there myself. It's really not that great actually. So part of this campaign is actually to look at industry as well and try and change industry workplace cultures and practices, because if you do one without the other, then actually young people see through it, and the public as well. So it's quite a major campaign to reposition engineering in the public mindset, so they do see it as a people-centred activity, but also addressing some of the policy issues we've talked about today in schools and in further and higher education, apprenticeships and so on, but also looking at industry.
Okay, take 2 more comments, then back up to the front.
I think one of the things that I find really sad in engineering is kind of that there's loads of really great stuff going on, but it's kind of all over the place, so people's experiences differ so much. So like when you were saying earlier about hearing from engineers that are doing these really awesome things, and not many people get to hear that. Like I was recently in the I'm an Engineer Get Me Out of Here thing, which is an online competition, and loads of schools sending more questions, and I find it really interesting because I felt really boring compared to the other engineers in my category, because there were people who were like measuring earthquakes and doing, so they were traipsing around volcanoes and stuff like that, and I was sitting there like, wow, I just work on gas. But I think there's so much stuff like that that's going on, but then only some schools have the time or the money, and some parents know about engineering and tell their kids, it's a great option, and other parents are like, why would you want to fix boilers? And there's just such a range of experiences for everyone, and it's whether there's a way you can better bring it all into one central kind of place, so that everything you need to know is there, and I think that would just be really
No, I agree. I mean, if anyone can do it, your academy can, but I completely agree.
I was just going to say the Royal Institution did something called the Unconference with students around Christmas, and a lot of this, I think what we were saying, came into the students' discussions that they were having that. I'm Julie Moot from the Aspires project at King's, and I wanted to flag that I think, is it Nigel, what we were talking about before about the gender, we're coming out with some interesting analyses comparing science and engineering. And we found that the gender gap between year 6s and year 11 for science got smaller, but for engineering got quite a lot bigger. And when we look at other influencing factors like cultural capital, family influences, these are very prelim results, but it looks like in engineering the only problem seems to be gender, whereas in science a lot of these other issues, cultural capital, ethnicity, family backgrounds, are more influencing. So if anyone's interested in having a chat about that, we'd be interested to hear your insights.
So would you like to sort of wrap up from what you've...
Okay, I'll go first and then you can respond. I think that's very interesting. When we changed our degree programs, our gender balance changed phenomenally. From the usual sort of, I guess at the time it would have been the usual sort of maybe 10% or something like that, women in the cohort, it went to very nearly 50. In fact, at one point we got it to 50 and it slid back a little bit. So we're now at about 40% for civil engineering. And that's because the degree, what they tell me, the degree is something which is inspiring to them to do stuff in the world, whether or not it's in civil engineering. The aim of the thing is to open their mind and be able to do stuff. And that seems to be very attractive to younger women, I think. So I think there's a sort of issue around how one talks to women and boys also, but how do we actually get the message across in a way that they are going to buy? And I think that's an interesting one. I think this has been a very interesting discussion. I think there's a lot of work to do to get the thing right, and I don't think anybody has the answer. So it's not that everybody's got to align with somebody. I think we have to try and work a lot together. I would encourage us, though, to bring into that conversation the people in school, the students in school. I learned a massive amount from students in schools about that, and I think also the people who are sort of early-ish in industry. So not just the sort of people who've been knocking around for a long time and the established people. Yes, they will need to be there because there are things they need to know. But actually to bring people who are absolutely there in the moment of this issue, because I think their perspective sort of gets forgotten. And I think we can actually learn an awful lot about how we do the other things by listening much more to them and seeing how they see their world, because we know the rest of it. That's the bit that has changed fantastically since any of us were in that position.
And I suppose from my personal perspective, what I would add is that, I mean, I'm thrilled to be working on, engineering issues with a creative industries mindset, and I think that the engineering sector has a lot it could learn from other sectors. I think looking at tech, looking at creative industries generally. I worked at some point in my career for a company called EMI, which generated quite a lot of income from Beatles records and used it to fund the EMI brain scanner in 1971, a copy of which is a model is in the Science Museum still. And obviously that company hasn't survived, sadly, on either front, but it shows that creativity goes, art and science, and they're not two sides of the same coin. They're not even a continuum, actually. They come from exactly the same source. And you can be creative in science and creative in arts. And I think that if you're doing a rebranding exercise, I think creativity has to be at the heart of it. It is hard when you're grappling with the English education system, but I think it's a battle worth fighting, and certainly you'll find allies in other sectors to help you fight it.
I think what I've taken from this evening is, I think your opening point about the image problem, the branding problem we have, you know, in many different strands. But I think there's a lot of positives we have. We have a great cohort of students coming through, young people coming through, doing industry, doing engineering, going into industry, developing. I think we do have some very strong institutions that are saying the right thing. And almost there's a positive of that. And I think, you know, Reese opened up saying about, you know, we lobbied for STEM because of a problem at the time. And I think that actually was very effective. Unfortunately, we lobbied slightly the wrong thing with STEM and this sort of math, science, which actually seems to have been taken on board by a lot of people, which at least gives us hope we might be able to modify that and get a more nuanced message of creativity and following on from that, because we've solved, I think, to some extent solved that one problem in some areas. There's at least a concentration on it. How effective it's been, but the lobbying seems to have been successful. But also, I think this whole point about the, you know, we touched on some of these things about what it means to be an engineer, where we started, and you know, we often automatically assume it's someone with an engineering degree working in an engineering company. Yet, actually, most of the people doing what we call engineering may not have come through that route. We know, but it's still in our mindset that it is. Despite actually a lot of the policy, the regulations from the institutions, and all sorts of things are there to allow it, it's not necessarily in the mindset yet. But there are people coming through it, and we continually have this argument about, is the person who fix your washing machine an engineer or not? And our use of the word keeps coming up, and who owns it and who feels it. I can't always decide which side we should fall on, whether that's just a pointless argument and we just should get over it and get on with, you know, people who solve things at whatever level of engineers, and there are different levels of engineering, we get on with it, or we fight that a bit more. It's a difficult one, but we have that whole image. We need to try and think about how we use it, and I think it comes down to the people in the industry coming through of how we're going to use these sort of terms and acknowledge them, because we do need Russell Group universities and other universities all over apprenticeships in different ways. I think the way UCL would engage with apprenticeships is different to some others, and quite rightly so. We're in different sectors of the university market, and the way we will engage with those things are going to be different. And that's pretty good, actually, because I don't think we do want just as we didn't want one degree that fits all, we don't want one apprenticeship that fits all, despite what documents from BIS will try and tell you they do. One of the things of that is that universities disliked the phrase subcontracted training provider. There was the phrase that was used for the universities in one of the documents, which just doesn't go. So, I would very much like to thank you all for your comments. I think it's been a fantastic debate. I think we've covered some really interesting topics. I'm not sure how many answers we've got to, but I'm not sure that was ever really the point. But hopefully some things that people can take away. I think. Thank you to Sara, thank you to Nick, and thank you to all for your input. I think we'll probably be another one of these, maybe around some of the things that came out about the apprenticeships in the white paper and the relationships in I think about 2 months' time. We've had some discussions about. So watch out. If you want to leave me details, I'll get you on the mailing list if you've not seen it already, but presumably you're somehow connected. To be here tonight. Thank you all. There's some drinks and nibbles in the foyer if you'd like to join and continue the conversation. And if not, I wish you a safe journey home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.